Welcome. Welcome to the deep dive. Today we're plunging into something that shapes almost everything you do, often without you even realizing it. Habits.
Exactly. Yeah, we like to think we're making these conscious, deliberate choices all day long, right? But researchers have found consistently that somewhere around 40%, maybe even more, of our daily actions, they aren't really decisions.
40%.
Wow, they're just habits playing out. William James, the psychologist,
Hmm.
back in 1892, he put it so strongly. He said, our life, so far as it has definite form, is but a mass of habits. It's quite an idea when you stop and think about it.
Okay, let's unpack that.
Yeah.
That alone is pretty striking, that so much of life is just autopilot.
Yeah.
We've got some really fascinating source material for this deep dive. We're looking into the science behind it all, why we do what we do, how these routines get wired into our brains, and crucially, how we can actually change them or build better ones.
And that's really our mission here, isn't it? To cut through the noise and pull out the most important, actionable insights from these sources. We want you to walk away really understanding the power of habits, not just in your own head, but how they shape groups, companies, even society.
Right.
And importantly, how you can use that understanding.
Yeah, get ready for some surprises, I think, some aha moments, and maybe a few things that make you look at your own daily grind a little differently. So where do we start? How do these habits even form? Our sources take us from, well, deep inside the brain.
Yeah, the neuroscience.
All the way to, like, the early days of advertising.
It really does start deep in the brain. There's this primitive area, the basal ganglia. And one of the most, dramatic ways we see this is with patients like HM.
Ah, the famous memory patient.
Exactly. He lost the ability to form new conscious memories after surgery, but incredibly, he could still form new habits, new physical routines.
You could learn things without remembering learning them.
Precisely. He'd get better at tasks, navigating his environment, even though he had no memory of ever doing it before. It showed that habit formation is separate from conscious memory. Your brain can wire in routines automatically.
That's just fascinating. Your brain's frozen in time one way, but still building new behaviors. And those rat experiments at MIT, they really showed the mechanism, right? The habit loop.
Oh, absolutely. And Graybeal's lab did groundbreaking work there. They put rats in mazes, chocolate reward at the end, the usual setup. And over time, the rats' brain activity changed. They weren't thinking their way through anymore. Instead, the neurons in their basal ganglia fired strongly right at the start, the cue, the maze entrance, and then again at the end when they got the reward.
And the middle part, the running.
It became automatic, less brain activity, and the key thing, those habits were incredibly persistent. Even if you took the reward away for a while, put it back later, the rats snapped right back into the old habit instantly.
So it's like the habit pathway never really goes away. It's just dormant.
Exactly. It's deeply embedded, which is efficient, right? Imagine consciously relearning how to drive every morning.
Oh yeah, our brains would just shut down.
Habits free up that mental energy. But, as the sources point out, there's a downside to this automaticity.
Like with Eugene, another memory patient story.
Yeah, a really tragic one. His life became almost entirely governed by these ingrained habits. He could function day to day based on routine. But without conscious thought to guide or adapt those routines, they eventually led to dangerous situations. His habits contributed to his decline.
It shows they're a real double-edged sword. Necessary, but potentially risky.
Absolutely. But the fundamental structure underneath all these examples, HM, the rats, Eugene, it's that simple neurological loop. Cue, routine, reward.
That's the core concept we need to grasp.
That's it. And understanding that loop, simple as it sounds, is the key. For personal change, for business, for understanding society, it all comes back to that.
Okay, so how did this idea, this loop, jump from the lab into the real world? I mean, influencing us. Our sources talk about Claude Hopkins, right? The advertising guy.
Yeah, a legend, early 20th century. No brain scanners then, but he just got the habit loop intuitively. He was brought in for Pepsodent toothpaste. And back then, brushing your teeth daily, not really a thing for most Americans.
Hard to imagine now.
Right. So Hopkins knew he had to create a habit. And he figured out you need two things. A really simple, obvious cue.
Yeah.
And a clear, desirable reward.
And his genius move was identifying the cue, wasn't it?
It really was. He focused on that slightly fuzzy feeling, the film everyone gets on their teeth.
Ah.
His ads basically said, run your tongue over your teeth. Feel that film. That's why they look dull. Use Pepsodent. He made a normal sensation feel like a problem you needed to fix. That was the cue.
Brilliant. So simple.
And the reward. beautiful, sparkling white teeth, feeling clean. So cue, feel the film, routine. Brush with Pepsodent. Reward, pretty smile, tingling, clean feeling. It sounds almost basic now, but it worked incredibly well. Pepsodent became huge and daily toothbrushing became a national habit.
A perfect real-world example of the loop in action. And those principles are still everywhere, right? Exercise routines, health campaigns.
Absolutely. Link a cue, like getting home, to a routine, like putting on running shoes, to a reward, like feeling less stressed. Same formula. But here's where it gets even more interesting and maybe a bit counterintuitive. The sources explain why these loops get so powerful. It's not just about getting the reward, it's about the anticipation, it's about craving.
Craving. Okay, tell me more. This is where Julio the monkey comes in.
Exactly. They monitored Julio's brain activity while he learned tasks for a squirt of blackberry juice. A nice reward for a monkey. At first, his brain's pleasure centers fired up when he got the juice. Makes sense.
Standard reward response.
Right. But as the task became a habit, something shifted. The pleasure signals started firing earlier. They fired when he saw the cue that predicted the juice was coming.
Whoa. So his brain started craving the reward before he even did the routine.
Precisely. The cue itself started triggering the pleasure, the anticipation, the craving. And these cravings are often subconscious, but they're incredibly powerful drivers. Think about walking through a mall.
Okay.
You're not even hungry. And then, bam, you smell Cinnabon.
Oh, yeah. Dangerous.
That smell, that's a cue. For many people, it triggers an immediate powerful craving. Your brain anticipates that sugary reward. By the time you actually see the store, the craving can be so strong you just buy it almost without thinking. The craving pulls the strings.
Okay, so the takeaway here for you listening is huge. If you want to change a habit, you have to figure out the craving behind it. If you don't know what deep down urge that routine is satisfying, you're kind of fighting blind, aren't you?
Absolutely. You're fighting a force you don't even recognize. The sources talk about exercise, too. People might start for logical reasons, health or whatever, but they often stick with it because they develop a craving for a specific reward. Maybe it's the endorphin rush. Maybe it's just that feeling of accomplishment. And Febreze, that's another great example. It initially failed when marketed just to eliminate odors. People didn't have a strong cue for invisible bad smells.
Right, how do you cue that?
Exactly. It only took off when they rebranded it as a reward. The final touch after cleaning, you spray it, get that nice clean scent, and it signifies job well done. It linked the product to the craving for a feeling of completion and cleanliness.
Okay, so we've got the loop, the cues, rewards, and this powerful role of cravings. Understanding it is one thing, but actually changing those deep habits, especially the ones we don't like, that feels like the really hard part. What strategies do the sources offer?
Well, one of the most significant examples they explore is Alcoholics Anonymous. AA is basically this huge, real-world laboratory for habit change. And a core part of their approach is helping people meticulously identify the cues that trigger their urge to drink. What situations, feelings, times a day.
So mapping out the start of the loop and then substituting a new routine, like calling a sponsor instead of taking a drink.
That's part of it, yes. Identifying the cue, changing the routine. But here's what the sources emphasize and what the alcoholics themselves often point to. That's not always enough for lasting change.
Okay. What's missing?
Belief.
Belief.
Yes. Researchers studying AA, like J. Scott Tonigan, found that a critical factor is the belief that change is actually possible for you. And, maybe even more importantly, the belief that you can handle stress and difficulty without falling back on the old habit. Because a new routine might work on a normal day, but on a really tough day, you need something more. You need to believe you can cope differently.
That makes sense. But where does that belief come from? Especially when you're struggling, believing seems like the hardest part.
Often it comes from community, from being part of a group. The sources really highlight this. Even a small group, maybe just 2 people, can make the possibility of change feel more real. Seeing others who have changed makes your own potential change feel attainable.
Ah, okay.
That's a huge reason why groups like AA can be effective. And studies looking at people who make really radical life changes often find they're involved in supportive social groups. Belief is easier to build together than alone.
Okay, so community fuels belief. What about willpower? That's usually what we think of first for breaking habits. Just grit your teeth.
Right, willpower. The sources definitely dig into this, and the research suggests it's not quite like a constant resource, it's more like a muscle.
A muscle. How so?
It gets tired with use. There's that famous experiment with cookies and radishes.
Oh, yeah, I think I remember this one.
Participants who had to resist freshly baked cookies, smell them, see them, and force themselves to eat radishes instead. They gave up much faster on a difficult puzzle task afterwards compared to people who got to eat the cookies.
Their self-control muscle was just worn out.
Exactly, depleted. It helps explain why someone on a strict diet might cave late at night, or why people make uncharacteristic mistakes when they're really tired or stressed. Willpower runs low.
Does that mean we're just doomed if we don't have a naturally strong willpower muscle?
Not at all. That's the good news. The same research suggests that, like a muscle, willpower can be strengthened through practice. And interestingly, practicing self-discipline in one area seems to spill over, like the studies by Oten and Cheng.
What did it find?
They had people practice self-control in one area, like managing money better or starting an exercise program, and they found improvements not just in that area, but in others too, like smoking less, eating healthier, studying more effectively.
So building discipline in one part of your life can boost your overall self-control.
It seems so. Small, consistent efforts matter. It's not just about fighting the specific bad habit head-on all the time.
That's actually really empowering.
Okay.
Another practical strategy mentioned was planning for obstacles, right?
Yeah.
Anticipating the hard parts.
Yes, planning for pain points. There was a study with orthopedic surgery patients. Recovery involves painful exercises. The patients who wrote down specific, detailed plans like, if I feel this specific pain during this exercise on Tuesday afternoon, I will do X to manage it and keep going. They were much more successful at sticking to their rehab than those who didn't make such concrete plans.
They didn't just have a goal. They had a plan for the predictable difficulties.
Exactly. They anticipated the friction points and planned how to overcome them.
So all this seems to lead to a kind of practical framework the sources lay out for changing habits.
Yeah, it boils down to roughly 4 steps. First, identify the routine you want to change. Really understand what you're actually doing. Second, experiment with rewards. When the urge hits, try different things instead of the old routine. Go for a walk, eat an apple, call someone. This helps you figure out the craving the old habit was satisfying. Is it boredom, stress, need for connection?
Finding the why.
Exactly. Third, once you know the craving, isolate the cue. What specific trigger sets off this whole loop? Location, time, emotion, other people.
Pinpoint the starting gun.
Right. And finally, have a plan, a concrete plan for when that cue hits. When see you, I will new routine to get similar reward. And crucially, plan for those moments when it's going to be tough.
So it's about consciously rebuilding the loop once you've taken it apart and understood the pieces.
That's a great way to put it, re-engineering the loop.
Now, this isn't just about us as individuals tweaking our routines. The sources are clear. Organizations run on habits, too. They call them routines.
That's absolutely right. Companies, governments, any large group develops these ingrained patterns. How decisions get made, how information flows. Often it's not some grand logical strategy, but these collective habits. Like that clothing company example, how a specific red cardigan ended up being featured wasn't one person's decision. It emerged from scattered habitual interactions between different teams. Nobody really decided it. It just happened through routines.
And these routines are necessary, aren't they? Like organizational muscle memory. They let complex things happen without constant replanning.
For sure, they provide efficiency and stability, unwritten rules. But, just like with personal habits, they can become dangerous. Rigidity, lack of communication, clinging to the old way. The King's Crossfire is such a stark, tragic example of that. Different departments had their own routines, their own turf. Nobody felt responsible for overall safety, like checking the escalator undersides or coordinating fire responses. The routines prevented effective action.
So how do organizations break free from those powerful, sometimes harmful routines? It seems even harder than changing personal habits.
Often, it takes a crisis, or at least the perception of one. The sources suggest that moments of turmoil make those ingrained routines suddenly malleable. Leaders like Tony Dungy turning around the struggling Buccaneers, or Paul O'Neill at Alcoa, or Howard Schultz returning to Starbucks during tough times, they leverage those crisis moments to fundamentally remake organizational habits.
O'Neill at Alcoa is fascinating.
Mm-hmm.
He focused relentlessly on worker safety above everything else.
He made it the absolute priority. And it wasn't just memos. He changed routines. He demanded immediate reporting of any accident directly to him. He made symbolic changes, too, like getting rid of executive parking spots.
To show everyone mattered equally in the new safety culture.
Exactly. It signaled a massive shift in the core habits and priorities of the company. And it worked, dramatically improving safety and eventually profits, too.
And you see similar things in, say, hospitals, shifting habits around authority for patient safety.
Right. The sense of crisis in modern medicine has allowed some hospitals, like Beth Israel Deaconess, to change deep-seated habits, empowering a nurse to challenge a surgeon during a procedure. That requires breaking old routines about hierarchy, driven by the new priority of patient safety. Crisis makes change possible.
So habits operate on every level, individual, organizational, and even societal.
Definitely. Think about retail. Stores are designed to exploit our collective shopping habits. Why is produce usually right at the front?
Make us feel good about buying healthy stuff first.
Pretty much. That feeling of virtue can subconsciously make you feel okay about tossing junk food in your cart later. It plays on a habit. And shopping lists. People make them, but sources say over half of purchase decisions happen at the shelf.
Impulse buys driven by store cues and habits.
Right. Our ingrained shopping routines often override our conscious plans.
And even our listening habits, how we react to music.
Yeah, our brains crave familiarity. It helps filter the constant noise. Radio stations learn this. When a radically new song like Outkast's Hey Ya came out, initial reactions weren't great. Too different.
I remember that. It was everywhere eventually, though.
Because stations learned to sandwich it, play it between two already popular, familiar hits that made it sound more familiar, leveraged existing listening habits, built a craving, and turned it into a massive hit.
Wow. Okay, and social habits, how groups behave.
Hugely powerful. Look at the Montgomery bus boycott. Rosa Parks' arrest was the spark, and her close friends provided the initial energy. Those are strong ties. But the boycott's real power, its endurance, came from the weak ties across the wider community. Acquaintances, church members, colleagues. There was a shared social habit, a sense of obligation to stand together, reinforced by social pressure. That collective habit fueled the movement.
And groups can also reinforce personal habit change, right? You mentioned AA.
Exactly. And Rick Warren's Saddleback Church is another example. It grew enormously, partly by structuring itself around small groups. This embedded participation into people's existing social habits and urges. Going to the small group wasn't just a decision you made each week, it became part of your routine, reinforced by the community. It made spiritual practices habitual.
So looking across all this, from neurons firing to massive social movements, it seems habits are everywhere, deeply ingrained.
They really are. But what's so fascinating and I think hopeful from these sources is the consistent message. Habits are not destiny.
Right. They might be powerful, they might run on autopilot much of the time, but they can be understood and reshaped.
Yeah.
We can choose our habits, or at least consciously work on them, if we understand how they work that loop, the cravings, the cues, the rewards, whether it's a personal thing or something at work, or just understanding societal trends. The principles are surprisingly similar.
Yeah. And change isn't always easy or quick, let's be clear about that. It takes real effort, awareness, persistence. But with that framework, identifying the routine, experimenting to find the real craving, isolating the cue, having a solid plan, building that crucial belief, maybe finding some community support, almost any habit can be changed or built.
Makes you think. William James, who we started with. After he deliberately worked on his own habits, making small conscious efforts daily, he wrote about feeling a rebirth of the moral life. If so much of what we do is habit, what does understanding that and deliberately choosing to change our habits actually mean for our sense of freedom, our sense of who we are?
That's a deep question. Definitely something to chew on after this deep dive.
Absolutely. Well, that's all the time we have for this deep dive. We really hope this journey into the power of habits has given you some valuable insights, maybe some practical tools, and perhaps a new way to look at your own life and the world around you.